Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the time to be on the floor. I want to continue talking about what I think are the real problems with where we are today. What you're hearing in the press is that there's no agreement on a continuing resolution, that there's conflict and lack of discussion in Washington, and that the debt limit is coming up, and that yet Washington isn't capable of solving its problems. And I made some points yesterday about the reason we're not capable of solving our problems is it's an absence of leadership. We're not only bankrupt financially, we're bankrupt in terms when it comes to our leadership. But I want to dispel the rumor that our problems aren't solvable. They're imminently solvable. We have $126 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities that Americans are responsible for. We have $17 trillion worth of debt. And we have $94 trillion of total assets in this country. That's if you add everything else everybody owns, the federal government owns, and everybody else. So the difference between 128 and 94 is 34, and then another 17. That's $51 trillion that we're going to have to account for. And what is in front of us, and by the way, Obamacare is going to add, Affordable Care Act will add $6.7 trillion to that outstanding liabilities, net of any tax revenues and tax increases that it collects. So what are we to do? What are the American people to think? They see impasse, they see lack of conversation, lack of compromise, lack of resolution, and no reconciliation. So I wanted to spend a few minutes today kind of giving a little history, first of all, and then outlining what is possible. Not saying we must do it, but what is possible over the next 10 years that we could do that would put us on a pathway to where we would be solving the problems and not leaving our children an inheritance of debt. And I made the point yesterday that the median family income in this country today, on real terms, in terms of real dollars, is exactly where it was in 1989. We're going backwards. We're going to go backwards this year. And what that really means is standard of living is declining. The American public is getting further and further behind. And one of the quotes that I use, and it's been attributed, and I don't know if it's accurate, is it's been attributed to John Tyler, a Scottish historian, but let me just read it. A democracy is always, and in this case a constitutional republic, is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by a dictatorship. Where are we in that line? Is $50 trillion in negative net worth not a sign we're going there? Is declining median family income not a sign we're going? What we've seen in this last so-called recovery is the wealthy have done very well, but nobody else has. So what we're seeing is history repeat itself in terms of what has been outlined and observed in the past. John Tyler was also accredited with this, but nobody can prove it. The average age of the world's greatest civilizations from the beginning of history has been about 200 years. During these 200 years, these nations always progressed through the following sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependency, from dependency back into bondage. Now, I think we're somewhere in here, if the history speaks accurately, or at least his observation of history. So what we ought to be about is making sure we cheat history. All of us, together. Liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, independents. We ought to be about cheating history. So how do we do that? Are the problems that we have in front of us so big that we can't solve them? I don't think so. Our position so hardened that we can't think in a long term about solving the problems that are in front of our country. And so when we talk about the debt ceiling, you know, I've been accosted a lot in the news media the last 48 hours because I don't believe the debt ceiling equals default on our obligations in terms of our sovereign debt. And it just so happens Moody's, the rating agency, agreed with me today that in fact they're not the same thing, and they say there should be no effect if we were to go over that. That doesn't mean we should. I'm not proposing that we should. But the scare tactics of saying the earth is going to collapse if we somehow fail on time to raise the debt limit is not true. The earth will collapse for Americans if we don't address the underlying problems facing our country, this $50 trillion in unfunded liability and negative net worth. And here's what we know has happened in the last 2 years. And it proves the point. It's why median family income is going down, is our debt is growing twice as fast as our economy. Here's our GDP increase over the last 2 years, $1.199 trillion. And here's our debt. It went up $2.405 trillion. All right, to say that another way, that's 2.4 billion millions. It's hard to, these numbers are unfathomable. But the graph shows it all. Is our GDP is increased. So what's happening is for every dollar in debt we go into, we're getting a decreasing return in our economy. And it's continuing to go down. So the more we borrow, the less well off we are in terms of being able to grow our economy. So the problems in front of us and what we see is what I would say is careerists don't want to solve the problem. Because the thing that comes to the careerist mind is how does that affect the next election? You know what? I don't care what happens in the next election in this country. What I care is whether or not we're really going to address the real problems and secure the future for the country. Whether they be Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives, I don't care. We're all in this together. And when our living standard goes down, we all go down together. So the mess we're in today. So how do you solve that problem? Well, the first thing in any addiction, which we have an addiction to spending, is to recognize you have an addiction. We have an addiction to spending. We have an addiction to not living within our means. We just passed $600 billion in January of increased taxes on the American economy. Most of that going from the people that are doing much better during this tepid recovery. Will that solve our problems? Can we tax our way out of this? Can we have confiscatory tax policies that will not hurt our economy and get us out of that? And the answer is no. And everybody recognizes it. So what else does everybody recognize? They recognize that a big portion of the problem is entitlement spending. And no political party wants to be blamed for being the person that, quote, fixed entitlement spending unless they do it together. So we have a great opportunity to together modify our mandatory spending programs and make significant savings. But having spent the last 9 years with my colleague who's on the floor oversighting the federal government, I can tell you, there's more we can do in things other than mandatory. So I thought I'd spend a few minutes just kind of going over a publication that I put out just a couple of summers ago. and it's called Back in Black. And it's not perfect. I'll be the first to admit it. And I know we won't ever pass $9 trillion worth of savings over 10 years. But here's $9 trillion worth of options that we could look at and take half of them and actually get on the road to health. Now, what would get on the road to health look like? It would be rising personal incomes, not declining personal incomes like we're seeing today. It would be rising median family incomes. It would be faster economic growth. Do you realize there's $3 trillion? Mr. President, am I out of time?
The senator has used his 10 minutes.
My request was for 30 minutes when I came to the floor. Evidently that wasn't made. Is the order of the day 10 minutes?
It is.
Well, I'd ask for just a very short additional time if my colleague from Delaware would allow it, and then I'll finish up.
The senator from Delaware. Without objection.
So anyhow, I'll spend some time tomorrow then on going through what this is. But solving our problem in such a way that it doesn't kick the can down the road, which is what we're getting ready to do. And what I would say in finishing, by increasing the debt limit, we let the politicians off the hook. Because then they don't have to make the hard choices that are required for us to live within our means.
Mr. President, parliamentary inquiry, if I may.
The senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I have no objection. I can stay 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and I'd like for Dr. Coburn to have a chance to finish what he was prepared to say. I'm not in a rush.
Mr. President, I just inquire if we have other speakers after Senator Carper.
There's not an order. Senator, there is no apparent order of speakers, and if there's no objection, the senator from Oklahoma can take an additional 20 minutes.
Well, I thank you. I will try. I really appreciate my colleague. He's a great colleague to work with. People always hear the stories about people who don't work together. I can tell you, Tom Coburn and I work together. He's my chairman, and I'm the ranking member on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, where most of this information came from, and he helped dig it up. What I would just say is we have an opportunity to do things. I mean, we have an opportunity for Democrats and Republicans to come together, forge a compromise, make major changes that are necessary and absolutely required if we're going to have a secure future. And I think we ought to look at it. And so what we did is we put together a plan that had a $3 trillion, that's $300 billion over 10 years in discretionary spending. That's non-mandatory. We had $1 trillion in defense spending, which is about what we've already gotten. Healthcare entitlements, $2.7 trillion, and we can go into the details of that. Tax code simplification, $1 trillion to come back to the federal government. Interest payment savings of $1.3 trillion, and Social Security reform that says it will be healthy for the next 75 years. That comes to $9 trillion that our kids aren't going to have to pay back. That's $9 trillion in money we're not going to borrow. So even if you just took half of that, $4.5 trillion, and said, we're going to get on the path to health. We're going to float that $3 trillion that's sitting in cash in Americans' bank account and give them the confidence back to invest it in our country. Make a massive difference in our country. Because what's really going on right now is a crisis of confidence. The American people don't trust the Congress. I think we got a pretty low rating this week, deservedly so. President Obama's approval ratings at his all-time low. So how do we fix that? We don't fix that individually. We don't fix that by pointing out what's wrong with the other person. We fix that by coming together and solving real problems that gives the American people the confidence that we have their best interest at heart, not in the short term, like Alexander Tyler was talking about, but in the long term. that in fact we want to secure the future for our kids and grandkids. So I think we ought to be about cutting up the credit card. And I know I'm in a minority in the Senate. I don't believe we should have another debt limit increase. I think the thing to force us to make these hard choices, because there's certainly not the political will to do it, is to put ourselves in a position where we are forced to make the hard choices. We're going to make them eventually. Everybody agrees to that. We're eventually going to make these changes, because there will come a time when we won't be able to borrow money no matter what interest rate we pay. So we're not talking about defaulting on our sovereign debt. We're not talking about not paying interest on our sovereign debt. We're talking about forcing ourselves into a position where we have to prioritize what we spend. What does the GAO reports tell us? They tell us a ton. Here, in the last 3 years, the GAO has given Congress wonderful information with which Congress has not acted on. What have they told us? They've told us we've got 91 different healthcare workforce training programs. 91. They've told us we've got 679 renewable energy initiatives, none of which have a metric on them. They've told us that we have 76 different drug abuse and prevention programs run by the federal government. They've told us that the Department of Defense has 159 different contracting organizations, none of them being held accountable. They've told us that at the Homeland Security, where Senator Carper, the senator from Delaware, and I, chair and vice chair of the committee, they have 6 different R&D facilities, 3 of which are doing exactly the same thing. We have 209 science, technology, engineering, and math programs. 209? 200 different crime prevention programs, 160 homeowners and renters assistance programs, 94 private sector green building assistance programs, none with a metric, and the agencies don't even know how much money they're spending on them. 82 teacher quality programs run by the federal government, half of which are not in the Department of Education. I won't continue it, but you get my point. What have we done about those things? Nothing. Where's the oversight on them? Not. So the whole idea for me, as somebody I'm thinking about the future more than I am a political career, is I think we ought to be working on those things. I think the American public expects us to be working on it. I will finish up just by saying that we've been running the credit card for a long time. And do we, in fact, have the right or the privilege or the ability to ask for an extension and a raising of our debt when, in fact, we haven't acted responsibly with our spending? Nobody else in the country gets their credit raised when you haven't acted responsibly. They actually check your credit score. They know what kind of bills you're paying, whether you're getting further behind. So should we, in fact, tear up the credit card? Should we force some good old adult supervision on Congress, to where we'll actually be forced to make difficult decisions about priorities on how we spend America's money? And when I mean America's money, I mean people out there working hard every day. They may not be the highest taxpayer, but it is unconscionable to me that when we spend their money, that we're wasting 15 to 20% of it all the time. So I think we ought to tear it up. The way we tear it up is we just tear it apart. We tear the credit card up. We shred the credit card and we say, you're going to live within your means. You're going to start making the hard choices. You are addicted to spending. You're addicted to not being responsible with the dollars you have. Congress needs to be in a 12-step program, and it should start with us. I thank my colleague, the senator from Delaware, for his patience and his friendship, and I yield the floor.